So do you believe that the American government had an inside job, actually brought the towers down, or that it was terrorists like the official story? Whether you have an opinion or whether you just are questioning, Towers of Deception offers some really, really interesting debate on this. And Barrie Zwicker joins us now. And Barrie, one of the things that I found most fascinating as someone who works in the media is the amount of footage from the day, from September 11th, that aired, that we've never seen again, that people are now pulling out of the archives to say, look, this was scripted.
Yes.
There are problems here.
Yes, it is surprising, and it's a lot of this information I learned after I wrote this book, or else it would be in there. But the going ahead right now on the assumption, which viewers could accept or not, they might be outraged or they might be delighted, but just for the moment, I'll go ahead on the assumption that I have in the book, that I truly, honestly believe, as a human being and a citizen and somebody who studied this for 5.5 years, that the tragedy of 9/11 was an inside job and was orchestrated by the White House. It was called a false flag operation, a terror fraud. So it was done, first of all, in my opinion, and not my opinion alone, by the perpetrators creating a storyline. This is extremely important. And there was the movie Wag the Dog that a lot of people saw, and that was done by Hollywood, and there was a whole fake war. So we know this fakery can be done, and it is done. So in my opinion, rather than saying, well, it could be this and could be that, I'll just go ahead and say, in my opinion, they had the top Hollywood scriptwriters who came in to create a drama that would carry the story that fanatical Muslims are the worst enemy of the United States of America and the American way of life and everything.
And of course, coincidentally, the Arabs coming from countries where oil is.
What a coincidence. Yes, what a coincidence. So so there are whole books about how rulers, if I may use that term, require an external enemy in order to mobilize the public and also to justify war, which is very profitable.
And some would say like Pearl Harbor.
And Pearl Harbor was a kind of false flag operation, I agree. I'm writing another book in which that'll be the second example. So anyway, we go back to 9/11. There's a storyline that these cunning Arabs, fanatical Muslims, jihadists, decided to strike the heart of America, that's Washington and New York, because they hate our way of life and they want to hurt America. And so how do you do that? Well, the Twin Towers immediately come into focus as an iconic target. Smashing planes into them actually wasn't new, as a lot of people did know. I mean, there was actually a TV show about an airliner called The Lone Gunman. Lone Ranger, I think, I may not have that right, who smashed a plane into the Twin Towers. That actually appeared as a fictional drama several years before this happened in real life. So obviously they knew it would be iconic, that it would be so shocking that it would paralyze and infantilize the population. Now, if you look at the actual footage, for instance, of the towers coming down, you can see that it's impossible that they came down because of impact, fire, which we can steal, which caused a pancake. And there are now physicists and structural engineers and so on who are saying that is completely not what happened. It was explosive charges set throughout the buildings, but it would look like that's what would happen. That is the plan. 2 planes, 2 impacts, 2 collapses. So then there has to be an explanation, because people can actually see with their own eyes that it wasn't exactly a pancake collapse. Why did all that stuff blow out? And people would start thinking about that unless a story was planted in their minds. And what luck. There were people who happened to be walking the streets of New York who explained very carefully, just in minutes after this happened, what happened.
To reporters.
To reporters.
Ostensibly man on the street.
Ostensibly man on the street. And an example is this, and you can find this at Brass Check TV, a little video called the 9/11 Solution, all drawn from authentic, original news tape, no question. And there's this guy in a Harley-Davidson t-shirt, and a Fox News reporter asks him what happened. And this guy, who actually doesn't seem to be very sad or very alarmed, he says, well, I saw the planes ream into the building, and then the buildings collapsed. Obviously, there was intense fire that melted the steel and caused them to collapse. He said, obviously, you know. And then the buildings came. I witnessed the buildings coming down. And so when you see this now, 5.5 years later, in the context of what we know, you can realize the guy isn't even talking like an authentic human being. People don't say at a fire, I witnessed smoke coming out of the building. They say, I saw smoke coming out of the building. He talks like an infomercial. And when you look at it again, like they play it about 3 times, and you can just see that he was planted there. He's never identified. Meanwhile, over at CBS, Dan Rather is interviewing a guy named Jerome Hauer, H-A-U-E-R. And he's just introduced as somebody who worked on one of Mayor Giuliani's committees. And this guy is saying, well, obviously, the impact of the planes weakened the steel, and then they pancaked. Very same thing the guy in the Harley-Davidson T-shirt is saying, and the very same thing a guy is saying over on MSNBC. This is all before noon on the day. And then this guy, Jerome Hauer, is having an interview with Dan Rather, and Dan Rather throws him a very softball question like, can you give us some perspective on this? And the guy says, well, it was obviously has all the fingerprints of bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And that's what they're saying on all the networks. Look at it. And we can look at it now as archival footage. They were planting a story everywhere. Jerome Hauer, by the way, turns out that he was the director of Kroll Associates, who had the security contract for the World Trade Center buildings and is a close Bush insider. And he's also a biowarfare expert. So this is no ordinary guy, but it was not divulged who he was when Dan Rather interviewed him. And so, and just one more example, because this comes over to print. I take the National Post, the Toronto Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the New York Times every day. Okay, so I saved all the newspapers. I was always saving the newspapers because of my TV work anyway to use as cutaways. And so I saved the papers from September the 12th on. Now in the September 12th National Post, they had huge pages and pages, maybe 20 pages about 9/11. Now, you have to ask, and one of these stories in one of these pages said, how did the towers fall? Which was the exact name of yesterday's event here at the University of Manitoba. And so in this story, it's amazing that they would quote so many experts, because you have to consider, nobody could start working on those stories until around 10 o'clock the day before. And then you'd have to have the assignment editors, you know, communicating with everybody. You'd have to find people to interview and so on.
And trust me, as someone who's worked in the media, trying to get experts to talk about something
just
can
like
be
that.
Yeah.
Exactly, just like that. And then there has to be, then they have to receive all the copy. They got to edit copy. They got to write the headlines. Got to do the layout. That has to go to the press. Have to be on the press. Has to have the delivery trucks. And it's delivered at my house at 6 o'clock the next morning. They had 10 hours at most to produce like 20 pages of fantastic stuff. One of the things says, how did the towers fall? So it's amazing. They have all these experts quoted. Here's what's more amazing. None of the experts that they quoted said that there were these 57 incredibly strong steel pillars in the center of the Twin Towers, which is vitally important. Because if the floors had pancaked, you would have had these things left sticking up like knitting needles. But what's even more amazing is the expert who was quoted who said there were no central towers in the twin, and central columns in the Twin Tower. In other words, lies were planted in our newspapers within hours of the events happening. The whole official story, which is by and large lies, was all carefully and calculatedly planted in our media. And then what happens is that that's the first story we hear. This is the first spin, the first explanations. And the first story that we hear about anything is the story that we will tend to believe and tend to defend. Our brains are actually wired to defend our pre-existing stories. And in my book in chapter 3, that's all about the psychology of it. And there's research that shows clearly that people are wired up to MRI machines, and they were told information that disagreed with a pre-existing story they believed. And when the people rejected that information that challenged the story they believed, and they said, I don't believe that, the pleasure centers of their brains flared up just as much as when an addict gets a fix. We are wired to reject information that we don't already agree with. It's horrible, you know. I mean, it makes you wonder about the future of our species. And then another thing is we're wired to go on believing, not only rejecting, but to go on believing. So that if somebody just questions the story in a general way, we have something called the baloney